It is delightful to be here. Beautiful facility. I'm amazed you're being used to the hospitals in the Bronx. It's a different cup of tea. What a beautiful facility, and so nice to be with you from Malta. It's a great, wonderful order, and I thank you for that. For this morning's reflection, what I would like to do is to be both practical, but also to be reflective. I mean, what we need to do with regard to end-of-life care is relatively well laid out. There are some directives. There was a copy of it either in your packet or on the table before. So the what we need to do, what it is that the church expects, even given what Alan was suggesting so right about the diversity of conditions throughout the world, the what we need to do is relatively clear, and I will try to cover that. But what I am interested in doing today especially is helping understand the why. Because I think that if we do understand the why, we say, what the church teaches and why the church teaches it, I think we'll be in a better position to do what we need to do and to avoid what we need to avoid, and we'll be able to communicate that better. When it's merely a set of rules, it can seem a little off-putting. I think Americans especially find that, our sense of what rules are and how you deal with rules. So while it is important to know what we should do, I really think it's even more important to know why we do what we do, and then it's all the more easy and we can identify ourselves with that a little bit better from the inside and help share that with others. So I hope that's helpful to you. I would also just like to say here at the start, I am mindful of how many personal situations there are, either because we're caregivers right now of somebody at home, or I know we've got the chaplaincy corps here with us, and we respect that, and so we've got lots of situations that we're dealing with, or maybe that we've dealt with in the past. I don't mind dealing with examples, but on the other hand, I don't want to stand up here as anybody's judge. So I'm really not interested in being here in the position of saying, did I do right with regard to what I did? I mean, maybe we could have that conversation privately, but it's probably not helpful, you know, to be dealing with that in quite so many explicit and direct words. It's probably better and more helpful of a conversation if we deal with it just at a little greater level of generality. But we need to get into practical details too. So I hope that's okay also as well. Just that I don't intend to be anybody's judge. I rather intend to speak about why we hold what we do as well as what we ought to be holding. Make sense? Good. Well, on the handouts that I've provided for you, in particular the one that's called The Teaching of Catholic Church on End-of-Life Ethics, what I've attempted to do here is to gather from some of the documents that the Church has put out, in both from Rome and here in the United States, as well as from various Episcopal conferences, some things that I would consider at the level of principles that will help to guide our conversation. So I'll use that as sort of a template. But just to look at the other pages, in addition to those 7 points that I think will help guide our conversation, I've also given some passages from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and below that from the document Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, and below that from a little letter that Pope John Paul II wrote shortly before the end of his own life. My goal in doing that is, in part, just to give you a sense of some of the documents that guide this discussion, perhaps letting you see that I'm not just making this up out of whole cloth. There's actually reason why I'm saying what I'm saying. And it's useful to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into those documents. Now, I am so mindful that documents that come out of the Holy See or the Bishops' Conference are sure cures for insomnia. On the other hand, when we have a nice practical topic like this, perhaps there'll be a way in which to enter into them more deeply. But I'd also, even before I start this, just like to do one thing with regard to dealing with documents. When it comes to documents like this, I have tried, in these 7 points I have on the first page, to dig out what I think we need to know and what will be helpful. But I'd also like to suggest to you a certain way of reading. And so I'm going to take just 1 minute here in the beginning to talk about a way of reading. It's something that I learned in college, I went to Xavier in Cincinnati for college. Yay, other Xavier, other Musketeers, okay. But I went to Xavier and I had a wonderful Shakespeare course. And the way, this was a year-long course, 2 semesters, we read every blessed play, and at the end of every 4 weeks, he would test us, and the way he'd test us, Karl Wentersdorf, if you remember Professor Wentersdorf, he would test us by giving us gobbets, 5 or 6 lines. And our job was to say what play, who was talking to whom, about what, in what act, and what scene. I said, how am I supposed to remember what act or what scene? He says, what you do is you, at the end of every scene, you write out in your own words, your own cliff notes. 1 sentence about what was in that scene. So that at the end of an act, you might have 5 or 6 sentences. At the end of a play, you might have 30, 35 sentences. He says, you'd be surprised what you'll remember about what act and what scene. That's short-term memory. But you will be able to follow the character development and the plot of the play. I used to get 100% on some of these tests, only because I had that other active use of my mind, that is, translating what was in that scene into 1 sentence, translating what was in that play into 30 sentences. Now, I admit you can't do that with reading everything. Try reading a Russian novel that way, right? On the other hand, if you do want to master even a Russian novel or even a Vatican document, if you will force yourself to a different active mind, that is, putting it into your own words, first you'll be surprised what you'll be able to remember. But secondly, if you don't figure out what's going on in a given paragraph or a given chapter, you've got a much sharper question for your conversation group or your study partner or your whatever. There's a way in which if you force yourself to read actively like that, rather than just reading passively, there will be a tremendous increase in your learning curve about figuring these things out, including these end-of-life issues, reading technical documents. Let me get back to what I'm supposed to talk about, but I just love sharing that. I'm so grateful to Karl Wentersdorf at Xavier University, because I've applied this to almost all the philosophy and theology that I do. I have a certain set of teaching techniques at Fordham, and in the course of doing this, I think I get better results if I can persuade people, including you, to work at that actively. So do well. Let's turn to our material. I start with some principles here that are absolutely essential for all of Catholic ethics, not just end-of-life ethics, to say all human life is sacred from the first moment of conception to the time of natural death. And I say this not as a throwaway line, but as something that's absolutely crucial. That is, when we're trying to focus in on end-of-life issues, but it would equally be true if we were dealing with beginning-of-life issues, or if we were dealing with Catholic social teaching, or if we were dealing with regard to sexual ethics, or if we're dealing with the ethics of war and peace. I gave a seminar this past year to some of our students, our seniors, and it was one of the best courses I think that I ever had the privilege to teach because of the blows back and forth trying to sort out these practical matters on war and peace. But it is so crucial to think about the truth of this. In a way, on questions of ethics, one ought to be able to say any question of ethics invariably involves a matter of justice. Justice means giving to another person what is fair, what is due. But how do you know what's fair or due? You know what something is fair or due in one of 2 ways. Either something is fair and due because of some agreement, or because of the nature of the person. I mean, it could be that something is fair or due because of a contract we've signed. I've said I'm going to do a certain amount of work. If I do it, it's only fair that I be compensated on the agreed price. On the other hand, some things are fair or due, not because of any agreement, but simply because of who I am, because of the nature of the human being, because of human nature or human personhood. In a way, the argument ought to stop at that level. Either something is fair and due because of our agreement and the carrying out of the agreement, or because of the nature of the human person, and yet we find that that is so compromised now. If you don't think of the human person as something that simply by human nature deserves a certain respect, has a certain dignity, then we're things like anything else, and we invariably get into some utilitarian comparative advantage, adding up the pluses and adding up the minuses. And people will treat even a human person as if it were merely one more commodity. Whether you're in Catholic social teaching dealing with wages, whether you're in end-of-life concerns dealing with how we should adjudicate questions about medical care, or any other aspect of ethics. And hence we always have to remind ourselves, and I just don't want to give this one short shrift, we have to meditate on what the source of human dignity is. It ought to be clear, even for a person without religious convictions, that a person is a person and not a thing like anything else. But often in our own day, it is not clear. And I would submit that the justification that is used by any form of totalitarianism whatsoever is to say that human beings are just things like anything else and may be used arbitrarily according to my power and my preference. What we ultimately say as Catholics, and so the deepest reason for our conviction of the importance of human dignity, is that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And hence, as things made in the image and likeness of God, we're different than every other kind of creature. Everything else is God's creature too. The electrons and the protons, the amoebas and the trees, the rocks and the rest of the animals. But they're not made in the image and likeness of God. What that means for us is that we are different and that there's a dignity regardless of our condition, regardless of our state of functioning, regardless of our abilities, regardless of any other condition. And that meditating on that alone keeps us away from bad decision-making personally, as well as from disorder in our community. So I mentioned this first. If you need a tagline to say it, I guess I would say, we are stewards of our life, we are not their owners. Let me just let us dwell on that for just a minute, because I think it's decisive for all the rest. If we start thinking of ourselves as owning our life, of owning our body, we will necessarily come to a different ethical conclusion. We are not the owners of our own lives. We are the stewards of something that God has created. I realize not everybody in our society agrees with that, but for the point of view of Catholic medical ethics, it is absolutely crucial. We can come back to that in discussion if you wish. Second point, all human beings, regardless of their physical and mental abilities, of their state of functioning, share an equal human dignity that merits both respect and protection. That is, the claim is that functioning is different from structure, from what we are. I do a course every fall at Fordham, Philosophy of the Human Person. And I'm thinking not only about the theological roots that I was explaining in point one, but in the philosophical roots. Again, without trying to reteach that course, let me just get to the real nub of it. I suspect that you'll find it useful, helpful in certain ways. When you give a definition of anything whatsoever, I don't exclude anything from my approach here. When you give a definition of anything, you tell the genus, that is the larger group, and then you tell the specific difference that identifies every member of that group. But our strategies in giving definition sometimes focus in on the ability to function. At other times, they deal with questions about structure that make function possible. In this whole debate about end-of-life ethics, but in many other debates about beginning-of-life ethics, about war and peace, about economics, often we end up looking at functionally based definitions. A functionally based definitions would be something like this. A human being is a human being and deserves to be regarded as a human being when it can function in a rational way, when it has a certain level of functioning. And people who take that functionally based definition tend to say, if you're not yet at that level of functioning, if you never will be because there's some bodily condition, the way you're conceived or the way you're born, if you're no longer at that level of functioning because of serious illness, because of some medical impairment, because of some injury. If we take a functionally based definition, we are going to be excluding from protection those who cannot yet or those who can no longer function in that way. I think functional based definitions are useful for other purposes. If I want to compare, for instance, I love doing this with my dear philosophy majors in that course. If you want to compare the human species with the orangutans, the bonobos, the dolphins, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, or whatever you got, we often will use a functionally based definition, right? Is even the mature, healthy individual capable of rational activity? For all the things that the bonobos, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, the dolphins can do, I still don't believe they're capable of rational activity. And we have a very interesting philosophical conversation about that. Whereas the human species, at the mature, healthy, well-functioning, are capable of this. But I don't use functioning as a test for membership. I use functioning as a way to distinguish a whole group from another whole group. If I used functionality, not only with the unborn or the young children, not only with the demented, not only with the people who are suffering from grave problems, but even some of my freshmen some of the time, wouldn't fit the test of the functioning, right? And functioning, that is, if that's being used as a membership criterion, suddenly it's really at the prey of a utilitarian calculus. Suddenly it's at the prey of a totalitarian regime. So my point is, if we're dealing with membership questions, what we have to deal with is structure. That is, whether or not we have a human genome, whether or not we're a member of the set, and everybody in the set needs to be protected regardless of level of functioning. On the other hand, if all we're trying to do is to say, does this group also count among those groups that are rational? If we discover the dolphins are rational, I'm going to be the first priest in a wetsuit, jump in, try to persuade them to get baptized. If we discover that the bonobos are rational, I'm going to get in the cage, although I hope I don't have to do that. Right? So my point is not to say we can prove that they're not rational. I see no indication that they've met the standard. If they are, then I deserve, and they deserve, the effort to try to evangelize them. I hope very much that we don't have to do that. Make sense? Okay. Third point. Persons are obligated to take reasonable care of their own health by preserving and nurturing it with appropriate and ordinary or proportionate means. No one is obliged to use extraordinary or disproportionate measures to prolong life in this world, that is, measures offering no reasonable hope of benefit or measures involving excessive hardship. I'm jumping here into the realm of medical ethics, right? There's a lot of steps I could take if we were giving every step along the line with regard to how justice works and how we care for one another. I am skipping at that point for the sake of this presentation. My point here is to jump into specifically the notion of medical care. That is, given the premises that every human being is made in God's image and likeness and deserves this care and protection because of dignity, and that it's not functionally based, the claim here that medical ethics makes is that we ourselves have a certain responsibility to take care of our health. It could be that we would investigate this with regard to the food that we eat, to the exercise, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. It could be that we could take some very careful note here with regard to taking that sort of ordinary care. But when we finally get to the question about medical care and medical interventions and medical therapeutic devices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what the church understands is that there is an obligation to use the medical care that is considered ordinary care, that this is not something optional, but that the church respects the fact that there are things that are extraordinary in some way. So what this is intended to do is to take note of a difference that is just crucial to medical ethics. namely a difference between what is ordinary medical procedure in a given culture at a given time. That's why I so enjoyed the point that Alan made at the beginning. What passes for ordinary here in the United States in an advanced place like northern Indiana is very different than what might happen in a place that is severely challenged with regard to the possibility of using any sorts of medical technology. What the Church understands, and this would be explained more fully in that document that is provided in your packet, that is the standards from the USCCB, is the way in which we try to appreciate that with regard to this country and to the facilities and the techniques that are available here. Taking this is to make a distinction between what is properly medical and what is simply human. So there are things that are human care, personal care. I presume we all like to eat and that we all like to drink. And that these sort of things are not medical care. So that the provision for food and for water, the provision for air and for temperature, the provision for cleanliness and hygiene, none of that is medical, even if it's provided in a medical facility. And hence the expectation is that giving people nutrition and hydration, giving people the kind of air they can breathe, giving people the right sort of temperature, giving people hygiene, and giving people personal attention, a little love. None of that is regarded as medical. With regard to things that are medical, we are saying there is certain kinds of care that is medical care, and that is ordinary medical care, and that is always required. But medical care, when it's given, is somehow things that alleviate pain, that take care of medical problems by the intervention of surgery, by the invention of medicines from the pharmacy, by the intervention of various forms of therapy, by the interventions of various forms of skilled personnel that are somehow designed to remedy a disease, to cure an illness, at least to reduce the pain if we can't cure the illness, to restore functioning. That is, medical care presumes sickness, medical care presumes illness, injury, somehow loss of functioning, and that what we expect is that what passes for ordinary in a given community, that is that which can be provided at reasonable cost, that which somehow doesn't involve disproportionate suffering, that which is not futile, that which at least has some hope of being successful and being an intervention that will provide for some manner or other of remediation of the disease, or if not able to remediate it, at least to reduce the pain involved, that is, if it is ordinary in a given community, the expectation is that it must be used. To the extent that something becomes disproportionate, becomes extraordinary, then there is a matter of choice. So that extraordinary care, disproportionate use of resources, disproportionate pain, disproportionate discomfort, those things become optional to the extent that they are disproportionate. When something becomes futile, it is not required. When something is disproportionate in the pain that it involves, in the risk that it is taken, in the amount of resources that are required, to that extent we regard it as disproportionate. Would that I could say that there was an absolutely clear line. But I can't say that there is. And I would be a fool to stand up here and to say that there was. So I don't want to be misunderstood. My contention is that there is a requirement for prudential reasoning. What I take point number 3 to be doing is to say we need to be doing that prudential reasoning. But in the effort to do that prudential reasoning, I'd like to make some distinctions that will help us do it. Here's the first distinction that I'd like to make. Now this takes us back to documents which I admit are the sure cures for insomnia. I refer especially to an absolutely wonderful document by Pope John Paul II, Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of the truth. It is in a way the basis in theological reasoning for the other documents that I have provided here, namely Evangelium Vitae, which is the document, the Gospel of Life, which covers questions about abortion, infanticide, but also euthanasia, and eventually capital punishment, any number of other life questions, and then is in turn the basis for the catechism. But let me tell this one point from Veritatis Splendor. I'd be willing to bet you a beer that in 100 years, I hope we're all around here so I can collect it on my bet, I'd be willing to bet you that in 100 years, the two documents from Pope John Paul II that are still going to be remembered and cherished especially are Veritatis Splendor, that is the splendor of the truth, this document on fundamental moral theology. The other one that I think is still going to be remembered is called Salvifici Doloris, that is the Christian meaning of human suffering. It's a sleeper. Almost nobody talks about it. I think it's brilliant. Here's the distinction. Basic structure, Veritatis Splendor has an opening chapter on the Bible, and it's on the parable of the rich young man. Remember that parable? Or that story from Jesus' life? Second chapter has all of the philosophical distinctions that only a philosopher's mother could love. Third chapter is the practical application. Okay, this is from that second chapter, but here's the way in which to understand the whole of the second chapter, I think. You all know about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Good cholesterol, something we actually find useful and helpful, doesn't hurt us. Bad cholesterol, ugh. Okay. What he does in chapter 2 is he makes the good cholesterol, bad cholesterol distinction on things like freedom and conscience, on truth and law, on the use of calculation of values, on final causality. He does this. I'm going to do just one of them, and it's on the word autonomy. It's in that very first section of chapter 2. There's a good cholesterol sense of autonomy, and there's a bad cholesterol sense of autonomy. The good cholesterol sense of autonomy is we are supposed to be increasingly autonomous. That is, we are increasingly supposed to be able to make good, prudent, well-informed conscience decisions. That's a good sense. We shouldn't be simply in somebody else's toe and let everybody make the decision for us and take no responsibility. That is, I tell my freshmen this all the time, you got to be responsible for the decisions you make. We have to grow in that. That's a perfectly good cholesterol sense of autonomy. Get your conscience well formed and you will increase your autonomy. The bad cholesterol sense of autonomy is to think that we can decide on the standards by which to make practical judgments. Make sense? Let me take you to a film that I bet you've seen. Maybe you've even seen it as a play. Have you seen the play about Thomas More, Man for All Season, or maybe seen the film? Okay, great film, right? Great story. It's your homework. But the homework in this sense, I think it's a wonderful film except for one thing directly related to what we're talking about here. I think that that particular film shows you the bad cholesterol sense of autonomy in a certain way. Remember, as the scene goes forward and Thomas More is eventually on trial, and he's on trial, as the film puts it, and it's relatively accurate, because he wouldn't sign what the king wanted him to sign. It pertained to the divorce, but even more it pertained to the freedom of the church in England. And at one point, when More is convicted, and then he feels the jig is up, I'm convicted, now I need to explain. Okay, something like that happened, right? After More's conviction, after he was sentenced, he finally did have a chance to explain. And what More says at that point is that he dies as a martyr of conscience. But the way in which Robert Bolt has him speak is to say, I am willing to die for the principles of my conscience. Nay, not my conscience, my conscience. You hear the difference? Conscience in the Catholic understanding of the word that we're referring to here with regard to the use of ordinary care, the optional ability, the use of the ability to make choices about disproportionate care, not having to do what is extraordinary. Those are a matter of my conscience, but it's not that I am autonomous in the sense that I can choose the standards. It's that I make choices according to standards that I never chose. The standards are the Ten Commandments. The standards are the natural moral law. The standards are things that I did. And I submit to you, Thomas More did not die for the standards that he chose. He died for his making choices in accordance with standards prior to his choice. He died for the Ten Commandments. He died for the natural moral law and the choices he needed to make in accordance with those standards. He did not die for being sincere or for being in conformity with whatever he happened to choose. Make sense? In the modern ethics that is not of Catholic orientation, I'm not opposed here to everything Immanuel Kant said, but there's a way in which what he unleashed is a notion of autonomy that has infected modern medical ethics. It has infected this whole subject. People are given the impression by some discussions of medical ethics that they must be autonomous, that is, they must be simply sincere and faithful to whatever principles they've chosen. I think that's bad cholesterol reasoning. I think that's taking autonomy as if I get to decide what my principles are. I don't want to belabor the point. I think that everybody's getting it. I'm seeing lots of nods. Imagine what my freshmen would do if they could say, I'm okay as long as I'm faithful to my own standards. You wouldn't want them to come back to you when they returned after freshman year. Rather, what we try to do is to help them understand, we all must understand, our autonomy is increasing self-mastery in learning how to make choices according to standards I didn't choose. Your pastors have no doubt taught you that there originally were 15 commandments, I presume? Not 10? Have they taught you that? No? Oh, Malta needs an education. Turns out there originally were 15, and Moses is coming down the hill, and he trips. One of the tablets breaks. He gets to the bottom of the hill, and he says, I got good news for you, and I got bad news. The good news is there were 15, now there's only 10. The bad news is adultery is still on the list? No, sorry, okay. My point is that those aren't options. That is, what we've got here in terms of the respect for life, particularly number 5 in this case. Murder is absolutely forbidden. That is, no matter one's state of condition, no matter one's ability to function, one may never deliberately cause the death of an innocent human being. Right? Medical ethics in this particular case comes down to that. You can't cause it for another. You can't cause it for yourself. You cannot tell somebody else to cause it. That is, autonomy does not extend to the point of saying, life is too miserable, I'm in too much pain, I'm not functioning well enough, I don't have the possibility of recovery, I don't prudently see that I've got enough. That is, at no point may one cause the death of a human being, either cause it actively or cause it passively. This is not to say that we may not allow death to occur. We may allow the person to die, and hence we're saying we do not need to use disproportionate means. When something has become too burdensome, when something has become too costly, when something has become too risky, there are various ways in which something becomes disproportional. We do not need to use every possible medical technique or medical intervention in the book when something has become disproportionate, whether futile or whether disproportionate for other reasons. But if something is a matter of ordinary medical treatment, we are nonetheless expected to use it. We can well imagine that somebody will be allowed to die, but we must not, by our omission of it, cause them to die. Let me just cut to the chase with one example, but I will follow out the rest of my principles. You can see where this is heading, but let me just draw it publicly into our conversation. How about the removal of nutrition and hydration when someone is in a relatively advanced state? We can well be in the position of saying that in the last day or two, it's down by the time you get to number 6 and 7, and I'll get there, but by way of an example, showing where I'm trying to go, not trying to hide it, in the course of the certain other disease or illness or injury and the status of that person, we can well understand that a person in the last 24, maybe in the last 48 hours, might not be able to take nutrition and hydration and actually use it. It might make them more sick than it's doing any good for them. So we do not say you must continue by medical judgment in the last 24, 48 hours, we can understand that that might not happen precisely because it's not doing them any good. But you may not, under any circumstances, starve a person to death or dehydrate them. The idea is this is not medical care. This is human care. Human care is always required so long as it is not futile. Our point then in trying to give the principles by which to make these prudential decisions is to say one may never cause death by commission, by the injection of something that would kill. One may never cause death by the removal of something that is required. We've still got that complicated case of the artificially induced nutrition and hydration that is in the technically supported version of it. But where I'm headed in this, as you can see, and what I would propose for our conversation and our discussion, what I am trying to head toward is our medicine, that is that which directly tries to deal with the illness, with the disease, with the injury, with the state of dementia, with the state of degeneration. Anything that is a medical intervention is subject to the ordinary, extraordinary distinction. We must use that which is ordinary, that which has the prospect of cure, of relieving pain, of improvement, etc., etc. We have some choice with regard to what is disproportionate or extraordinary. We have no choice with regard to providing for human care. We do have now suddenly a prudential decision needed when even ordinary human care is something that is futile or making somebody more sick. So what I propose to you, as taking note of this, I'll be back to number 4, but back to number 5, but what I've tried to say with regard to number 4 is we have a certain freedom, a certain legitimate autonomy. The second number 4, you can see I've misnumbered them. Number 5, I'm going to come back to, the suffering is a mystery. Nutrition and hydration should always be provided when they are capable of sustaining human life. When they actually become futile, that is, when a person can no longer accept it, we allow. What we do not allow is that a person be starved to death or dehydrated to death. That is, we do not allow that you cause death by the removal of nutrition and hydration. Number 7, I'll be back to that number, mislabeled number 5. Number 7, because this life has inherent dignity, regardless of its quality, what we must always do is provide the appropriate care. And hence, John Paul II, in the document that's referred to and quoted for you toward the end of the handout, insisted on providing for it merely by the fact that it is technically assisted or artificially provided does not transfer it over into the realm of medical care. So let me just try to clarify that a little bit. Merely by the fact that something is using technical means. You don't have to introduce the technical means, right? If you can continue to spoon feed, if you can continue to straw feed, there's something preferable about that. But if one uses a peg, if one uses some other technical assistance, the mere use of the technical machinery, the mere use of technology doesn't make something medical. I don't say this in my own voice, but rather I think you'll find it in the documents. This is where I think that where there is sometimes confusion and where I understand that there is so much discussion. Because some people assume that any use of technology makes something medical. But rather where the church tries to draw the line and offers us for our guidance is the notion of we must still ask ourselves the question about, is this something medical? Is it designed to address the disease, address the illness, address the injury? Or is this something designed to provide provide human care, the ordinary kind of care? Once it's in the realm of medicine, that is addressing the disease, addressing the illness, then we rightly regard it as subject to the ordinary, extraordinary distinction. If it is not addressing the illness, then we must simply be asking the question about futile, even if it's burdensome. Let me conclude this before we turn to our theological reflection and any question you may have with the mislabeled number 4, what should be number 5. It is the notion that suffering is indeed a mystery. Medicine does serve to try to relieve the suffering of the sick by its treatment, by its research. Suffering that cannot be alleviated is still within the realm of what can be redemptive. This is the thing that I find especially in John Paul II's interesting essay, The Christian Meaning of Human Suffering. I think that we are inclined by secular conversation. We're inclined to not take account of this. That is, utilitarian ethics sees no point in suffering. I don't want to simply harp on Peter Singer. He's the favorite whipping boy of those in my profession. You've probably heard of him. He's got that kind of fame. But he stands for that position, and so I'll deal with the position in general more and not just with Peter Singer. He stands for the position that suffering has no meaning, that we should indeed try to alleviate suffering, but when we cannot alleviate suffering, then we should bring an end to suffering by active or by the omission of action so that we end the suffering in euthanasia. In a way, this is to miss the point of what our Catholic understanding of things is, that suffering can have a meaning. And that I think, and I especially turn to the chaplaincy here because I suspect you deal with this all the time, but I think we all deal with it, namely the way in which suffering can have a meaning. And yet what we have to do, I think, is to help people to see it and to show it. I'll tell just a brief story in this regard and then stop and see if we want to have questions or if we want to go to the discussion questions of our theological reflection. I deal with a lot of people in New York, but especially a man named George. George is someone whom one of the first people I got to know 20 years ago when I came to New York. He was a very ebullient fellow at that point. About 6 years ago, he suffered a stroke. His doctors told him, you need to have carotid artery surgery, clean this out. As you all know, carotid artery surgery works wonders. My father had it, gave him two more years of really great alertness with more blood flow to the brain. George had the surgery. He was within that small percentage, had a second stroke. It left him unable to talk, entirely paralyzed on his right side. With his left side, he can sort of use his finger, he can sort of grab some stuff. If you prop him up, he can sort of balance himself on his left foot. He still loves to do his walking. Every once in a while, Judith will call up and she'll say, I think George is mad at God again. George is mad. Would you come over? So I go over. George and I have a conversation. It's a one-sided conversation in some ways. I'm not talking about what happens between spouses. Just teasing. When we have this conversation, I usually say to George, after we've done our pleasantries, George, are you mad at God? George, it's okay to be mad at God. Yell at him. He's a big boy, he can take it. For one thing, we can't hear you. You're not going to disturb anybody. George, yell at him. It's far more important that you give him a piece of your mind than that you give him the cold shoulder. God loves to be talked to about our own situation. I'll say more about this at Mass and the homily, but my point in bringing it up to you now is that suffering has a redemptive character if we will unite it with Christ's suffering. He came and chose suffering as the means of our redemption. And so while we don't want to inflict or allow any unneeded suffering on anybody, nonetheless we understand suffering even more profoundly than the Greeks did when a person like Aeschylus said, all wisdom comes through suffering. That there's a way in which when we can't alleviate it, it is important to find a meaning for it and not to think that it must be ended in a violent means. That is, the first principle, coming from the fifth commandment, is such that suffering never trumps commandment number 5. Rather, what we are is in the position of saying we need to relieve it where possible, and we need to humanize it, and especially we need to supernaturalize it. We need to give people that particular way of dealing with end-of-life issues, which will allow them to see the supernatural in their dying. Let me conclude then on this comment. When we are dealing with a person in life's end stages, sure, absolute best use of the medicine, best use of the palliative care, but we never want to prevent a person from having enough consciousness that they can do what they need to do in the end-of-life stages. And what they need to do is to prepare themselves to meet their Maker. What they need to do is to take care of any sin that remains. What they need to do is to heal broken relationships. What they need to do is to be able to say goodbye. And so it means using the palliative care and the pain relief, but not using it in such a way as to obliterate consciousness, if it all can. Hence, one of the things that I'm sure your physicians and your pastoral care staff here knows is that to have good palliative care and good pain relief medicine is that there is a desperate need to stay well hydrated. The medicines in palliative care only work if there's fluid going through the system. And if there is not enough hydration, you need to increase the dosages of the pain medicine. But increasing the dosages of the pain medicine obliterates consciousness. What we stand for is not continuing life or prolonging it at all costs. Hence the need to say we do not need to use disproportionate means. What we do stand for is allowing a person to remain conscious so far as one can, so that one can prepare oneself to meet one's Maker, so that one can heal broken relationships, so that one can confess and be truly forgiven of one's sin, so that one can prepare to die. Hence our need for that compassion, but a true compassion and not a false compassion. A good cholesterol compassion and not a bad cholesterol compassion, just as we need a good cholesterol autonomy and not a bad cholesterol autonomy with regard to the decisions. In the second part, we'll have a chance to look at some more particular things like living will, advanced care directives, healthcare proxies. We'll get to some of those practical details. This was more the background why.